Well, good afternoon, and welcome to the Catholic Prison Ministry Coalition's town hall meeting. Today's subject is the cycle of control and ending sexual abuse in confinement. My name is Kimberly Limore. I am on the Executive Steering Committee of CPMC and your host for today. We welcome you and thank you for joining us. Our format is usually I will open with prayer, introduce our speaker, and she'll take it away. If you have any questions as she is presenting, please feel free to put your questions in the chat and we will be monitoring it. Just a little word of warning, I am on a hotspot because I lost power in our building today. So if it's a little delay or going in and out, hopefully it won't be too bad. I have a hotspot as a backup here, so maybe I could switch to that sometime during this presentation if needed. So again, thank you and welcome. Our opening prayer for today, in Chicago, where I'm located in the Archdiocese of Chicago, we have to take what they call a Virtus class. And Virtus is protecting God's children and elderly against abuse. And so they have a prayer of healing for victims of abuse, which I would like to start with today. So let's place ourselves in the presence of God. God of endless love, ever caring, ever strong, always present, always just. You gave your only Son to save us by the blood of his cross. Gentle Jesus, shepherd of peace, join to your own suffering, the pain of all who have been hurt in body, mind, and spirit by those who betrayed the trust placed in them. Hear our cries, O Lord, as we agonize over the harm done to our brothers and our sisters. Breathe wisdom into our prayers. Soothe restless hearts with hope. Steady shaken spirits with faith. Show us the way to justice and wholeness, enlightened by truth and enfolded in your mercy. Holy Spirit, comforter of hearts, heal your people's wounds and transform our brokenness. Grant us courage and wisdom, humility and grace, so that we may act with justice and find peace in you. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. So today's facilitator of this much needed conversation is Linda McFarlane. Linda is an MSW and an LCSW, and she is the Executive Director and Board Secretary of Detention International. Linda manages all of JDI's work in the US and internationally and serves as the organization's primary spokesperson. A licensed social worker, Linda has more than 30 years of experience working with survivors of sexual abuse, domestic violence, and child abuse. Previously, Linda served as JDI's Deputy Executive Director. In that role, she trained corrections officials, medical and mental health practitioners, and direct service providers in preventing and responding to sexual violence behind bars. She also worked with corrections agencies on implementing programs to make their facilities safer. Before joining JDI in 2005, Linda worked in community rape crisis programs, foster care with adults with mental illness and with adults with mental illness. She also worked as a staff member, unit supervisor, and therapist in a detention facility for girls with mental illness. So today, again, we welcome Linda McFarlane to facilitate this wonderful, this much needed conversation.
Well, hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm really pleased to be here to talk about this important issue and about your incredibly critical role in supporting people. The prayer was a really beautiful way to start. I'll say I was grateful for the moment to breathe deeply and listen and feel that prayer and reflect on why we're all here. So that was a wonderful way to start. Thank you. Um, as Kimberly mentioned, please feel free to drop questions or comments in the chat. As I said earlier, when we were getting our tech in line for this, I love being interrupted because I want this to be useful to you. So if you have questions, comments, things that have come up in your work, please jump in. I have I have an outline for what I'll say today, and I'll go through it, but it's all, of course, much more useful if we lean into what your questions are. So as Kimberly mentioned, I'm with Just Detention International. We're a health and human rights organization that works to end sexual abuse in all forms of detention. We do our work on several different ways, different layers. We do direct services work with incarcerated people and corrections staff. We do training and technical assistance with corrections staff and service providers and supporters. And we do national and federal level and state level policy and advocacy work. We have offices in Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., and Johannesburg, South Africa, where we do work throughout the region of Southern Africa. We start from a base that no matter what crime a person may have committed, rape is not part of the penalty. We start from a base of nobody deserves to be sexually assaulted ever, no matter what. Basic core human rights principle. In the prayer that we opened with, we talked about peace and justice and care. And I also want to just note that for you all who do work in prisons, and thank you for that. Thank you for doing that work. I know you know what it means to people, but I can't say enough what it means to people inside to have somebody from the outside see them as a full human being and care about them and care about what's in their heart and their mind, and not see them as the worst day of their lives, as the worst mistake they've ever made. And I want to thank you for that work. And I also want to say that prisons are hard places to be, and don't need to tell you that. And prisoners have often, well, like any group of people, there's some people within it. It's difficult. You hear terrible things. You may hear terrible stories. You may witness awful things. And it's really important for you all as well to take care of yourselves, right? That when we're talking about trauma and human rights abuses, it touches, it's like static, or if you've ever been around lots of small kids in a preschool or something, it's like glitter, right? It gets on everything and it stays. And so it's really important to remember that just being a witness and your role and the role of anyone who supports survivors of trauma is to be a compassionate witness, that having that compassion can have a cost in terms of vicarious trauma, or also what they call compassion fatigue. So I just wanted to note that self-care, care for each other, gatherings like this can be a great place, right? You're with other people who understand what you do and what you see every day. So why are we talking about this? I think we talk about what life is like inside prisons and jails. We talk about abuse, and it can be really easy to get lost in statistics and also the sort of the morass of the difficulty. But we need to remember that behind each of those stories, behind each of those numbers, behind the reason that the Prison Rape Elimination Act, which we'll talk about in a minute, was passed, there are human beings, hearts and souls, who have gone through something horrifying and been harmed. So you're all advocates and allies for humans, for people, And I just wanted to share this quote from Frank, that if he had had that, he was sexually abused in a county jail at a time way before PREA was passed, way before people were talking about this at all. And he was very much alone. And he didn't know he could trust and who he could talk to. And he seemed to have nobody. And I just want to thank you all again for changing that experience for people like Frank. A note that we also, part of our organization is our Survivor Council. And that's made up of about a dozen people currently and formerly incarcerated who've experienced sexual abuse in detention, who speak, who train, who work on policy and advocacy with us, many of whom were instrumental in both the original passage of the Prison Rape Elimination Act and of the eventual creation of the standards. And all the stories, all of the faces of affected people that I'll share today are members of our Survivor Council. So just want to make sure you know that these are people who are volunteer advocates who have asked to and are passionate about helping to do this work by sharing their own experiences. I'd like to share, just get us started with a brief video. And we're gonna test out the tech here and see how we do. And this is a video of Joe. And what I want you to pay attention to in this video, it's actually a video that we originally, we created to help bring along folks who are doing support work for incarcerated people with a focus on rape crisis centers. But I think what Joe has to share will also really resonate with your work. So as you're listening, just note, if you could, what it is that Joe mentioned was so instrumental in beginning him on a healing path.
There are quite a few different officers that an inmate has to check in with. And all those people, they all referred to me by my number. That advocate asked me what my name was. Because I'm not a thing. Because I'm a person with a name. And the first thing I told her was, my name's Joe.
Joe was one of the first clients I had, and I was brand new, like sexual assault advocate. Most of my communication with incarcerated survivors was through letters, and I would read, these words, and the feelings that they were expressing weren't all that different than any other survivor that I had worked with. The self-blame, the shame, the fear, the trauma, all of that stuff just was very similar to everyone else that I had worked with. The big difference being that, their resources were so limited, and their ability to self-soothe and their ability to seek out appropriate support was almost nothing.
I went to a psychologist. And my plan is that no matter what, am I going back into that cell? Psych says, okay, we'll get you moved. So I leave the psych, and here come the cops. And he comes up to me and he tells me, he says, all right, let's go. I said, where are we going? He said, back to your cell. Put me in waist chains and put me back in the cell. nobody would let me out. I was on top of my bed. I was on the top bunk. He grabbed my ankle and he pulled me off the bed and proceeded to rape me. And the second night he raped me, and the third, and the fourth. Getting in contact with Jessica saved my life.
Some of the things that I would hear in the letters was just a lot of feeling isolated. And, you know, with survivors who weren't incarcerated, you know, they could just pick up the phone and call. You know, we had a 24-hour crisis line. They could call whenever they, you know, felt like it. But with the incarcerated survivors, you know, their access to that communication was so limited. And so there was something really powerful and like tangible about getting a letter, you know, and you could see how hard they wrote or what their handwriting looked like. And then being able to write back, it was kind of this opportunity to be very thoughtful in a way that I couldn't have been on the phone. Like in an immediate crisis, I was able to really be very thoughtful in my responses.
Jessica was my advocate when I was assaulted. She was the person that said it wasn't my fault.
I meant it.
That was a turning point for me. As soon as she told me, I know you've been raped, I knew, without a doubt, and she could have never said another word to me. At that point, I knew that I hadn't done this. After the assault, I had been treated like a number. And she asked me my name and she touched my hand as a human being. And it really made a difference. My name is Joe.
So I'd just like to, just ask for a moment if there is any reactions, or just if what folks heard, both what Joe's sort of needs for emotional, spiritual, mental care were, and honestly what the very simple things Jessica did that this was years later. We made this video probably about 5 years after Joe even got out of prison. So many years after the abuse happened and he worked with Jessica. So yeah, any thoughts or any questions, comments, reactions? So what I'd like to highlight really is in some ways, I think it can be nerve-wracking to think about getting a disclosure from someone who's been sexually assaulted. And it can be nerve-wracking to feel like, I know what to say. Am I going to say the wrong thing? And I think that what And that's a really natural response. And I think what a lot of people do is go into asking questions, right? Because it's horrifying to hear about and think, how could that happen? How could what just Joe described happen? And we start asking questions. Well, who did you tell? Why didn't you tell a different person? If that, sort of even asking questions that may come off to the survivor as feeling blaming. And you heard Joe didn't need any help blaming himself, right? He was already, as he says in the video, that Jessica saying it wasn't his fault and she knew that he had been raped was a real turning point. The other turning point was her simply using his name, his first name. She asked what he called himself. He said Joe, and she used that name. And so this sort of treating someone, no judgment, no blame for the abuse, and as a compassionate witness and validation for their experiences and feelings, that's what's most important to most survivors of sexual abuse and what you can do. And anyone can do that. And if you find yourself getting caught in the trauma, wanting to ask lots of questions, I think it's important to just sort of take a deep breath and think, I can be a compassionate witness. So why is this such a big deal? Why is there a law? We now know from the research that the Bureau of Justice Statistics has done that about 200,000 people, adults, are abused behind bars every year in the US. And that's people, not incidents. Most people who have experienced abuse are abused anywhere from 3 to 5 times. So when we talk about the number of assaults, it's 3 to 5 times that number. When we talk about youth facilities, that didn't include youth. 7.1% of youth in juvenile facilities report being sexually abused while in detention. The good news here is what we know is this is research that came out after the Prison Rape Elimination Act standards had been enacted. Before that, this number was much higher. It was 12%. So we have seen, we don't have that comparison with adult yet because the Bureau of Justice Assistance hasn't done new research in adult facilities since the PREA standards were enacted, at least that's been released. But what we can see is in youth facilities, all the work that we've all been doing around prevention, detection, and response to sexual abuse, at least in youth facilities, is having an impact. It's still, that's still a human rights crisis right there, right? If we put children in facilities in order to reset them, right? To help them reset and move on and have lives as healthy, productive adults, and 7.1% of them are being sexually assaulted. That's still too much, but at least we can see we're making some progress. In prisons and jails, adult, it's about half, equal rates, sexual abuse by staff or by other incarcerated people. And we say staff, we mean all kinds of staff, not just correct. When we say staff, people often think uniformed officers. It's not just uniformed officers, it's all kinds of staff. In youth detention, it's more like 82% of the abuse is committed by staff. Youth are 3 times more likely to be abused by staff than by other youth. We hear a lot about this in the news, and I just want to note that recently there has been a lot about sexual abuse by staff in women's facilities. Terrifyingly, at the federal prison in Dublin, California, recently both the warden and the chaplain were indicted for multiple counts of sexual abuse of incarcerated women at that facility. So in the facilities where you do work, you may hear about PREA being used to, weaponize against staff and lots of false reports. And I'm not saying there's never a problem with incarcerated people misusing mechanisms that are put in place for their safety. I'm not Pollyanna-ish enough to say that, but what we need to remember too is that a lot of people who are in danger on a daily basis are still not reporting and still not getting help. And the abuse is going on for years and years. So that's an important, and I want to acknowledge, challenging balance. Again, I think that survivors of this abuse can share so much more eloquently than I ever could about what it's really like. So I want to share another story. This is a very short 3-minute video. Stephanie is a member of our board of directors and our executive committee. In that role in our executive committee, she is the liaison between our board of directors and our survivor council. And I'll share. This is her pictured with her young son here.
My name is Stephanie Walker. I'm here in Augusta, Georgia. I'm originally from Columbia, South Carolina. There was officers who had explained to me that the facility that I would actually spend my 2 years at was a new facility, and it was a minimum security facility, and that I would be okay. There were rumors that there was things going on with the captain there. I would be requested to come into his office, and that's where things just went completely haywire. I went into a deep dark area to where it's that I shut down, and I didn't know who to talk to, because everybody at that facility was almost family. So you didn't know, as far as regular officers, you didn't know who to trust. You find more trust in a person without a uniform on, because there's no connections there. You find, if I had that opportunity to speak to an advocate who came in without a uniform, I would have probably trusted that person a lot more. The officers would let me go and stand on the breezeway just so that I could breathe, and I would be crying, and sometimes, you know, trying to get my breath in, but they would think that I'm going through this because I was missing my son, and had no clue that I was going through this because either I had just been touched or I had just been raped by an officer. When I got home, the number that was listed on my re-entry where I went home to, he started calling that number every day. Hearing his voice, I could see the visions of what he had done to me every time in the office. That gave me a reason to fight. That gave me a reason not to give up. If I shed a tear, bear with me. They're not tears of pain anymore. They are tears of joy. My son and my husband has been the biggest therapy that I could have possibly had. I know how it felt to be silent. I know how it felt not to have a voice. It's giving that voice. It's helping someone else have a voice that I didn't have. And now I have one, and I just can't be quiet.
So Stephanie mentioned that officers, so she was being abused by this one particular captain who, as she mentioned, continued to stalk and harass her after she got out. Oops, gosh. Sorry. I don't know if you're hearing that, but seems like the next video in the row just started to play. So officers who Stephanie perceived as helpful and kind actually noticed that she was going through a really difficult time. But because they didn't really understand trauma, they thought it was, she said, missing her son, and they never asked, right? They never asked, but they would let her sort of get some extra time outside to take a walk or things like that. So she was very grateful for that. But again, thinking about your role, if someone had ever asked, she might have been able to share when she was inside, and nobody ever asked. Really, like, what's going on? Is something wrong? Has something changed? Because that's what she's described to me, is that sure, she wasn't happy to be in prison and away from her family. That's terrible. And she had an addiction, and she got caught up in things, and she, was sort of first time in prison. She didn't understand what was going on. So yes, she was disoriented, and traumatized by the whole experience. But then there was a shift to where she was having panic attacks and crying all the time. And nobody said, Stephanie, what changed? And so again, that's something you all can look for and ask. What changed? Is there something going on? Is there something you need help with? And I just want to make another point that when we provide support to survivors like Joe, survivors like Stephanie, what often happens is that they then become really powerful advocates and supporters in their own right as a part of their healing. So as I mentioned, Stephanie is on our board of directors. She's on our executive committee. She's the liaison for the other survivors in our organization. And she's also started a nonprofit herself called I Am No Longer Silent. And so when we give folks, and maybe their role, if they're part of a faith community, they can provide that kind of role to others in that faith-based community. They can become supporters and mentors for others. And when we give folks that support, that's what they're able to do. And yeah, I see a comment, the Old Boy Network is alive and well. Inmates are not believed or respected. Yes, absolutely. And I think so, even if Stephanie had a staff member ask her, it was a captain, right? They may not have stood up for her. They may not have done anything. And yes, and when you think about all of those headlines I shared earlier, it's fascinating. Actually, I just want to say that to your point about the network, the Old Boy Network. Recently, the Senate Committee on Investigations held a hearing about sexual abuse in women's facilities by staff in the wake of some of those headlines I shared. And there were 3 survivors who testified at the hearing. It was a very powerful hearing. It was actually very well run, very well done. And when Senator Ron Johnson was the ranking member on the committee, George Ossoff was the chair. And at one point in the hearing, Ron Johnson asked them all to sort of go down the line, did you report? Did you report? Did you report? Did you report? And they all said no, they hadn't reported on their own ever. In every single case, somebody from the Bureau of Prisons reached out to them after they were transferred or released and said, we're doing an investigation. And in every single case of these 3 women, they didn't know how they had their names. And so what that tells us is that everybody knew, right? And again, to your point about the Old Boys Network, none of these women reported. All of them, they said they didn't even tell other incarcerated people or doctors or chaplains or anyone in all 3 of these cases. But investigators knew to reach out to them months and years later in some cases. So everybody knew, which is very disturbing. And that's obviously something we have to work to change. I'm going to share again, but I want to pause and ask if there's any other questions or comments right now. All right, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. I'm not going to talk about, so we're talking about reporting. In the Bureau of Justice Statistics research, they did ask, did you report? And if not, why? And the reasons that people gave aren't particularly shocking. People were ashamed or embarrassed, didn't want anyone to know. Those are things that you would hear from any survivor of sexual abuse anywhere, right? In the community, at a school, anywhere. They thought staff would not investigate, as you mentioned earlier, Bill, the, Old Boys Network. Yes. Are you going to investigate your own colleagues? People don't believe it's going to happen. They're also afraid of the perpetrator, and they're also being afraid of being punished for reporting, which we hear all the time. And you may see in some of the facilities you work in, people being put in solitary confinement or administrative segregation, or having privileges taken away in some way after they make a report. So what do you think, like, what kind of reactions? I think we always talk about reporting as the solution, right? People just need to report. People just need to report. But what do you think? What are some of the reactions that folks get when they do report sexual abuse? And just put them, you can just put any thoughts about what you think people hear in the chat. Retaliation, the well, you deserved it attitude from others. Absolutely. Absolutely. Hear that all the time. What did you expect? Why did you get locked up in the first time? Just not being believed. And like you heard Joe say, Jessica just believing him was one of the biggest things. Fear of what's going to happen to them next. Absolutely. What's going to happen? Are they going to get moved, right? And so for many people, depending on your state or if it's a federal, maybe they get visits from their family. And this is particularly compelling for women, for their children, right? When many states only have one women's facility. So what am I going to say? The only option, they're going to lock me up in ADSEG. And so absolutely, these are some of the things. People are afraid of retaliation. They're afraid of not being believed. They're afraid of being judged and blamed. So what we have heard, and these are real things we've heard from people, but how could you let it happen? That blame, are you for real? From other incarcerated people, there's, a stigma, right? People feeling marked, like that scarlet letter, right? From correctional counselors, mental health folks being blamed. You keep getting into these situations. Why do you let yourself get into these situations? And simply just not being believed. And then I think what's really scary for people is to report and then to have nothing happen, right? Because then it's exposed and they're actually in more danger. And so that's, in many ways, I think where you come in. Yeah, moved into SEG during the investigation. They're not supposed to be, per PREA, left there for longer than is necessary for safety. And if a less restrictive environment is possible for safety, they're supposed to use that. And yeah, and that segregation, what happens when you go to segregation? I've had corrections officials say to me, but we're not doing it for punishment, we're doing it to keep them safe. And it's like, well, that's nice. And that's a sweet idea, but they lose their privileges, they lose their programming. In some cases in California, they're in their underwear, right? They don't get the same food. If they have visits, they can't have them, they can't make phone calls. And so regardless of how it's framed, it is punishment. Absolutely. So when we think about your role, I think, and advocates like Jessica's role, that relationship, that ability to provide support to someone and work with them, it's another option for response rather than reporting. I think a lot of times corrections facilities really have everything hinge upon reporting. But when you're thinking about sexual abuse, that's never going to be the solution. Because first, even in the community, the FBI estimates that about 2 to 5% of sexual assaults are ever reported, even in the community where people don't fear getting put into ADSEG. So we think about the reporting barriers in detention. It's also, if you think about it, it's counting on the people who are most in danger to solve the problem. And that's not fair. Can't do that, right? So I think that's, again, where you all have a really critical role in providing support and guidance, and also advocating for people and modeling in the facility a way to communicate with and treat people and handle issues of trauma that is different from the usual response.
Linda, can you outline like the bill and what facilities or what the facilities are responsible or how they're supposed to handle this?
Absolutely. So how do we advocate and be the voice for the person assaulted? And yeah, let's get to that. We'll get to that too, Karen. That's such an important question. So the Prison Rape Elimination Act was passed in 2003. It was passed unanimously by both houses of Congress. Can anyone imagine that happening today? What a thing. And one of the many things that was required was that the Department of Justice create a set of national standards. And when we talk about PREA and people talk about PREA, usually they're talking about the standards. And there's 140 something provisions within the standards. They're long, they're detailed, and technically they apply to all detention facilities that are under the auspices of the Department of Justice. So prisons, jails, state-run youth facilities. They provide detailed guidelines around prevention, detection, and response. And there are 4 sets of standards, actually, one for prisons and jails, one for youth facilities, one for community confinement facilities, and one for police lockups. So within the standards, there are requirements around housing, there are requirements around prevention and response, and there are requirements around investigation. Basically, when you look at them as a whole, their goal is to keep people safe. They require multiple ways to report. So people are supposed to be able to report anonymously, verbally, in writing, and to an external mechanism that's external to the department. They also are supposed to protect survivors and other people who may be vulnerable from abusers by being careful and thoughtful about housing. When somebody reports, they are not supposed to be penalized in any way for making what we call a good faith report. So if someone makes a report and they believed it to be true, even if it's not substantiated by the investigation, per the PREA standards, the facility is not allowed to penalize people for making a false report. And so that can be very tricky and sticky, right? Because not all, and there's 3 different outcomes to an investigation: founded, which means there is enough evidence to show it happened; unfounded, which means there's enough evidence to show it did not happen; and unsubstantiated, which means we're not coming to a conclusion either way. More than 80% of sexual assault investigations rest at unsubstantiated, which is not a very satisfying outcome, right? But if it's unsubstantiated, doesn't mean it didn't happen. It just means the investigation is not enough to take it to a district attorney for prosecution, right? People are supposed to get access to medical and mental health care, all kinds of medical and mental health care related to sexual abuse, access to an outside victim advocate, either via a hotline or letters. And if they're taken for a forensic exam, a rape kit exam after sexual abuse, they're supposed to have an advocate present during the exam from a qualified community rape crisis center. That's kind of the broad strokes, if you will. And the question, how does PREA apply? Does PREA apply to immigrant detention facilities? It's kind of a fun, sort of wonky issue there. When the Prison Rape Elimination Act was written, yes, it did, because the Department of Homeland Security didn't exist yet. It hadn't been created pursuant to the Patriot Act. And so the intention was that immigration facilities be covered. However, it took 9 years for the standards to be promulgated. By the time the standards were released and finalized by the Department of Justice, the Department of Homeland Security existed, and immigration facilities, or ICE, no longer fell under the Department of Justice. So technically it couldn't. However, Then President Obama issued a presidential memo saying that all federal agencies that incarcerate people must either comply with the PREA standards or create their own. And Department of Homeland Security created their own, which are very similar. In some cases, they're actually a little stronger. So Department of Homeland Security actually has its own. Any other questions about PREA? And Kimberly, what specific, again, there's a lot of standards there. So what specifically would be most helpful, do you think?
Well, you know, I think one of the things that ends up kind of as common knowledge, or what ends up happening in all organizations, there is a like staff is protecting staff, or, you know, that those groupings of people that want to protect each other. So who actually will do the oversight of these facilities?
That is a great question. So each one of the things the PREA standards require is that each department have a PREA coordinator and each facility have a PREA compliance manager. And those people are tasked with making sure that their facility implements the full set of PREA standards. Of course, they're employees. And in one case, for example, at FCI Dublin, where both the warden and the chaplain were indicted, the warden was the PREA coordinator. So that's a problem, right? So as there needs to be external oversight, the mechanism that exists, which is far from perfect, and we're all working on fixing it, are audits. And if you're working within a facility, you should definitely hear about the audits and be interviewed. So the Department of Justice trains and certifies auditors. They are technically independent auditors. I will say the majority of them are former corrections staff, but they can't audit a place that they've worked within the last 3 years or been paid in any way, like as a consultant in the last 3 years. So that's in there to protect sort of that old boy network and cronyism. Again, it's certainly not perfect. The training is quite rigorous. The standards for the audits are quite rigorous. They have to go through every single standard. When we train, I've been part of the auditor training. When we train the auditors, we talk about triangulation. So they have to look at what they have to do a pre-audit, and they have to review all the documentation, policies, practices, protocols, training manuals, etc. And by the way, one of the requirements is that all volunteers and consultants also receive training on their responsibilities and roles related to PREA. So as chaplains, you should all have that. You should all get training. You should have all received training around your responsibilities vis-a-vis the Prison Rape Elimination Act. If you haven't, you could ask your volunteer coordinator about that. So those auditors then, what is it that they've read? And they have to go on site. They're supposed to interview. There's a set number of people they have to interview of all different kinds, different staff and incarcerated people. They're supposed to interview volunteers. Some of you may have been interviewed by the auditors. And then after that, they do a wrap up and they do a full report. And in order to pass the audit, the facility has to pass or meet expectations every single one of the standards. So that's the oversight mechanism we have related to PREA right now. Again, it's really far from perfect because it doesn't necessarily ask what's happening now. It asks about the previous year, right? So for example, FCI Dublin passed their audit and they may well, so the PREA standards are definitely a floor and they're a place to start, but they don't mean that there might not be abuse going on within a facility. Question, it seems easy to stand up for the victim, but what good happens when we report a perpetrator who confesses to us, a non-ordained chaplains, to a violation that happened in the past, especially before incarceration and coming to Christ? How do we best help the person we're ministering to? That is a great question. So, excuse me. I think I'm going to jump ahead to this. Because I think, so per PREA, if you are in a counseling role, and you should get this in your volunteer training, right? If in many cases, if you're a volunteer or staff at a facility, you're required to report anything that happened within the facility. If the person is reporting something that happened in their past, say prior to their incarceration, and they're an adult, they're not a child, and you're not under any mandatory reporting requirements for child abuse or elder abuse or dependent adults abuse, my counsel would be that you don't have to report that, right? That if you are in that counseling role, that support role. Now, if you're a non-ordained chaplain, you can't sort of necessarily use that role. Excuse me, I'm so sorry. As protection for confidentiality, because I think you're right. And implied in your question there, Terry, is that reporting it is to the facility is not always the helpful thing to do for the person you're working with, right? Because it may not help them in any way. So actually, are you saying, let me just clarify, you're saying when we report a perpetrator and the perpetrator has confessed to you? Or I see, I get you. So if you're, going back. So if you were saying, if you're working with someone who tells you that they sexually assaulted somebody in their past, that maybe they're not in there for, they weren't convicted of. And I think it depends on, I mean, for me, like I'm a social worker, and so I can answer from that perspective. It would depend very much on what's going on there, right? Are there any, this person's incarcerated, nobody else is in danger, right? When I'm coming to report child abuse or elder abuse or dependent adult abuse, part of my calculus is anyone else in danger from this person right now? I would say if it's a staff member, potentially people are still in danger if this person is still working there, right? And so I think it really depends on your role and the guidance that you get per your volunteer role, and what is your role and your in relation to the church and and as a chaplain, about whether it's the best thing to report. If somebody, and I guess if you're non-ordained, then you don't have the protection of confession necessarily. I'm just checking that for nodding, and that's part of the question. If it's within confession, then you should be able to use that no matter what someone tells you, right? As protection around confidentiality. But I do agree with you that there isn't one simple answer, that making a report to law enforcement isn't always the best thing. And I tend, when I'm working with folks, to talk through their options with them and use a problem solving approach about what would be best for them and for everyone else. So again, I'd say in the terms of a perpetrator confessing to you, I think it would depend a great deal on the circumstances and the situation. I realize that's not necessarily super clear or satisfying answer, but I would just say that reporting to law enforcement isn't always the best thing to do.
So unfortunately, we're
I know, sorry.
I know, I think we need a part 2 on this to continue on. I think, one of the things when we have these hard subject matters, is difficult to process initially.
Yeah.
And come up with the questions that we need to ask. So I believe that there's going to be a part 2. But we appreciate you, Linda, and all of this information. Is there any way that people, and maybe you could put it in the chat, they could reach out to you?
Yeah.
If questions come up after we
There you go.
okay, great.
Yeah, absolutely. And Bill asked a quick question about what can we do if, someone who's been has reported, but the institution isn't handling it properly. I think what you can do is reach out to the department-wide PREA coordinator for help. You can reach out to whoever oversees your role, the volunteer coordinator. And if it's you can also, the PREA Resource Center. If you just Google PREA Resource Center, you'll find it. I can also share that with anyone who's interested. Has a mechanism for reporting problems with an audit. The other thing you can do is, if you know that an audit is coming up and they're supposed to post these for 90 days ahead, you can reach out to the auditor and let them know about the concern. You can also reach out to us. We do advocacy and training and technical assistance. If there's a particular situation or case, you could reach out to us and we can see what we might be able to do to help as well. You can also give the survivor our legal mail address to write to us.
Well, thank you again, Linda. This has been so enlightening, and it's a critical conversation to continue to have. So I hope that you are available the next time we reach out to you.
Absolutely.
Again,
I'd be happy to talk to others. And if folks have questions or would like to reach out, please feel free. I'm always happy to try to help.
Okay. And as always, we have a few announcements for our upcoming programming. Kara's going to put that on the screen for us real quick. As she's doing that, one of the things we're going to be having starting on Tuesday, January 24th. I'm sorry. Okay, advocacy, where are we going here? Okay, here we go. Financial empowerment, capacity building, youth and family, excuse me, a two-part seminar or webinar that's happening on Tuesday, January 24th and Tuesday, January 31st. So please, again, all of this information is on the CPMC website, which is catholicprisonministries.org. So please go out there and check that out. We're doing this in partnership with Catholic Charities and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. So we invite you all to that. Do we have another announcement, Cara? Yes, here we go. Advocate Network panel on next Wednesday, January 18th. There's going to be a panel talking about our advocacy programs that help us as prison ministers, or help those that are prison ministers, the resources. And that's what CPMC is about, offering resources to those that are in prison ministry to be able to connect together and talk to each other. So again, we thank you all for joining us in our first town hall of the new year. I failed to say Happy New Year to everyone, but Happy New Year on this 2023. And as we go forth and continue to learn how to be more effective, compassionate ministers to those that are, their dignity has been kind of stripped from them. So we continue to look for ways to be able to reach out and help those that are struggling. Again, thank you. We hope that you join us for any upcoming events. Again, go to our website. All the websites for Just Detention and PREA are in the chat. And you can go look at that. And I think we will put that on our website also at CPMC. Again, thank you and have a blessed week.